So welcome. We have a very interesting session this evening. It's on what, where, and when is the Global South. And we're very grateful for our collaboration and support from the Center for Study for Developing Societies. And thank you, Prathama Banerjee, for putting this together. And to all our panelists, including Shivani Kapoor, who's come from Jindal. We have done a lot of collaborative work with Jindal. But before we hear from our panelists, just a quick introduction about the center in Delhi for those of you that might be coming here for the first time, to tell you a little bit about us and the University of Chicago and our connection to India. So the University of Chicago has had a very long history of engagement, not only with Indian scholars, but also Indian institutions. And our history dates back to 1893 with the visit of Swami Vivekanand and the 1913 visit of the Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore. It was in 1965 that the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations was established at the university, and it helped to make it a widely respected hub for both the modern and classical languages in India. And from 1973 to 81, the department also led the translation of the critical edition of the Mahabharata. In 1983, it was the astrophysicist Subramaniam Chandrasekhar who received the Nobel Prize in Physics and pioneered human understanding of the black holes. And he was a faculty member at the University of Chicago. In 2001, the University of Chicago, Professor Paul Sereno joined an expedition that was led by Suresh Srivastava of the Geological Society of India and Ashok Sani of Punjab University to uncover the Rajasaurus normadensis, the first fossil remains of a dinosaur that was found in India. And as you walk in through the center, you can actually see a replica of the skull that we recently unveiled. It's on your right-hand side when you walk out. So please do stop by and have a look. The center in Delhi builds upon a very long and rich history of intellectual collaboration between the university and India, and it has greatly expanded the work that the university has done in India in the last 5 years. Since our opening in 2014, we have hosted over 590 events with more than 140 collaborative institutions and 30,000 participants. It is also the site of regular programming for the alumni network in India, and we engage with the community here. The center also houses several long-term initiatives in areas such as energy, environment, and health that have helped to establish the center as a vital presence in the region. The Tata Center for Development at the University of Chicago and the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago, EPIC India, are both located at the center. My colleague Lenny Chaudhary is here. She's the country director for the Tata Center for Development. And the work that the TCD, as we call it, has been doing is very interesting because the portfolio spans 40 projects in more than a dozen states on a wide range of thematic areas, which not only include energy and environment, but also health, medicine, labor economics, and urban development. And all the research projects of the TCD are led by University of Chicago faculty, mostly in collaboration and consultation, not only with the central, but state governments. A flagship project that they do is called Real-Time River Quality Monitoring and the Water to Cloud project, which has garnered a lot of attention of regulatory bodies, not only of the Central Pollution Control Commission, but also the National Green Tribunal. EPIC India, as I mentioned, carries research projects in 10 Indian states, and their model includes carrying out foundational research to solve vital problems and carry out policy engagement to create lasting impacts and communicate the evidence then to drive change. One of the major projects that EPIC colleagues here at the center have launched, which might be of interest, is called the Star Rating Program, where our researchers are working with state pollution control boards and other partner organizations, not only in Odisha, but also Maharashtra and Jharkhand, towards strengthening environmental regulations through transparency. Under this scheme, industries are rated from 1 to 5 stars based on the amount of air pollution that is emitted from their smokestacks. Another very interesting program that we have here at the center is called the IIC, which is a social impact fellowship that runs as part of the University of Chicago Trust and the Harris School of Public Policy. You may have seen some of our younger fellows out there outside. They've been working here. And this fellowship brings young professionals to the government and not-for-profit organizations for a period of 1 to 3 years. The fellows conduct comprehensive research, design sustainable solutions, implement and iterate interventions, and evaluate outcomes and scale best practices by engaging diverse stakeholders across the system. While our centers illustrate the importance of our commitment, they are nothing but a springboard for our collaboration throughout the country. We seek to build our engagement around the bottom-up approach of our faculty and invest in more comprehensive relationship with our partners. Today's event is an example of such partnerships, and we're very delighted to have with us, along with our collaborators, we have faculty that are visiting from the university, Mark Bradley, who's a Bernard Schmidt Distinguished Professor of History and College, and he also serves as a faculty director of the Pozen Family Center for Human Rights and is the Deputy Dean of the Social Sciences Division. He is here with Leah Feldman, the Assistant Professor for Comparative Literature from the University of Chicago, and they're joined by two more colleagues right here in the audience. We have Gwenba Hayek, who's the Associate Professor for Modern Arabic Literature in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, and Darrell Lee, who's an anthropologist and attorney. So we look forward to a very productive evening of discussions. And Prathama, over to you.
Good evening, everybody, and it's a real delight to be part of this panel. And thank you, Aditi, for organizing this. Aditi has already introduced Mark and Leah. Shivani teaches the Center for Writing Studies in Jindal University and has fascinating work on the sense of smell and caste labor. It's a wonderfully cross-disciplinary and cross-regional panel with literature, political theory, international relations, ethnography, all coming together. Leah has worked on the Caucasian region, Central Asia, post-socialist areas. Mark has worked on Vietnam and has a kind of a larger geopolitical frame for his work. Shivani has worked on India and has conversed with colleagues in South African universities. So there is a certain mobility already to this, both intellectual and physical, to this panel. And the question, as you can see, is a very bare question. Credit to Leah for framing it as such. What, where, and when is Global South? Is the Global South a geopolitical category at all, as were the earlier terms such as the Third World or the developing and the underdeveloped? Or is it a gesture towards a non-territorial or deterritorialized intellectual space? Is it a gesture towards a post-colonial turn, when we have moved from the critique of Eurocentrism to a kind of assemblage called what we call Global South? Is it a gesture towards a post-national positioning? Is it a gesture towards moving away from area studies schools in diverse parts of the world? Does the category work at all, or does it not? These and many other questions will be addressed by our panel, and we will open it up at the end to a larger discussion involving the audience. And so the order will be Leah, Shivani, and Mark. So enjoy.
Thank you so much, Prathama. And thank you so much, Aditi, and to the entire staff here for coordinating our visit. I've just arrived this morning, but it's already been a really exciting day. So I'm going to just frame this question through the ways in which I came to think about the Global South vis-a-vis my own work, because it's a sort of strange location to think about the Global South through the former Soviet South in Central Asia and the Caucasus. And then I'm going to use this to think about whether the term, to what use the term can be applied in my work in comparative literature, and then to use this to kind of specify two examples from my forthcoming work. I came to this discussion from the margins, my work on the margins of the Soviet Empire. And my first book explores the formation of the empire from the vantage point of the Caucasus in the 1920s. And more recently, I've been thinking about the empire's long collapse from the vantage point of Central Asia from the late 60s and 70s and on. But one of the problems in my work has always been how to frame the colonial and post-colonial legacy of the Caucasus and Central Asia alongside the non-alignment movement's opposition to Soviet power. And as I began this research on the role of Soviet officials in Central Asia and the Caucasus in Soviet-sponsored international organizations such as the Afro-Asian Writers Association and film festivals that were held from 1958 on, right, just following the Bandung conference, non-alignment conference in 1956. through the 70s, I began to notice a lot of overlapping participation between writers and filmmakers, both in the Soviet-aligned and non-aligned circuits. On the one hand, places like Tashkent, Uzbekistan, were used by the Central Soviet administration as a site to propagandize a vision of the communist East. And this is the kind of second version of the Soviet International, if we think about the 1920s and the expansion of the Soviet empire as the first iteration of it. So in the 60s, there's this return to the vision of a kind of global Soviet or communist South as a way to expand the Soviet empire. However, on the other hand, I'm thinking about local writers and filmmakers working for the Soviet administration and the ways in which they generated alternative forms of solidarity that went off script, so to speak. So as I worked to connect this research on the Caucasus and Central Asia to similar post-colonial trajectories, I find myself returning to this term, the Global South, to question its value for framing this research in the context of literary scholarship. So the history of the term for me intersects precisely with this Cold War divide, and this is precisely one of the reasons that it's interesting as a sort of intellectual genealogy, to evoke this intellectual genealogy. Its history can be traced to, on the one hand, the subaltern international solidarity of Gramsci's Southern Question, or as well as the US Third World intellectual and activist exchanges. But it also has come to be defined as a post-Cold War cartography. It was used by US military strategists for the last 20 years to distinguish a functional globalized core from a non-integrated gap, which would include the Caribbean Rim, all of Africa, the Balkans, the Caucasus, Central Asia, the Middle East, Southwest Asia, and much of Southeast Asia, as, quote, dangerously connected from the globalizing world. So in this way, it has this very problematic entanglement with this sort of post-Cold War US military strategy. So then with this tense history, this tense political history, how can we recuperate the term? In humanities scholarship, the term has more recently gained force to trace an alternative world literature framework that is always adjacent to, but extends beyond Euro-American geography. What I find interesting here is that in outlining a kind of alternative world literature production scheme, it traces different networks of power through publishing and conference funding that extends beyond a more familiar framework in world literature of the structures of colonialism. That is, it traces the sort of these neoliberal infrastructural development that crosses colonial trajectories. As we see with aligned and non-aligned publications, for example, the journal Lotus, which seemed to get funding from both Soviet and non-aligned sources, these networks not only crossed ideological alignments, communist and capitalist, but their funding also traced more diffuse networks of power. But if we look at this problem from the vantage point of the forms of solidarity of individual actors, that is, writers and filmmakers and thinkers, how did they formulate alternative modes of solidarity across aligned and non-aligned networks, be they aesthetic, ideological, or institutional and financial? And I'm really interested here in thinking about the intersection of these domains, aesthetic, ideological, and infrastructural. I'd like to call these a kind of South-South solidarity. And I'm interested in asking, how do informal economies circulate? How do writers and artists and thinkers forge forms of generative affiliations in the work for thinking political engagement outside of the corrosive effects of both colonialism and post-colonial nationalism? What kind of bonds emerge through forms of failed solidarity? And here I'm thinking about the failures of post-colonial power structures, such as mandates from Moscow that go awry in Tashkent, for example. How do these failures expose Moscow's less obvious imperial propagandizing role? I'm really at the beginning of this work, but I'll just offer two examples from cases that I'm exploring. One of which will be part of a forthcoming article that will be coming out in Boundary 2 entitled Global South Toward a Material materialist poetics of alignment. And in this essay, I explore alternative forms of political solidarity through what I call a poetics of longing that connects Soviet-aligned South in Kyrgyzstan with non-aligned South in decolonial Algeria through a reading of two love stories by Kyrgyz author and diplomat Chingiz Atmatov, writing in 1958 on the periphery of the Soviet Union, and Algerian poet and political leader Melik Haddad, writing a year later amidst the Algerian War of Independence. And this article traces institutional and personal networks that persisted despite the often tense ideological divide between the Soviet-aligned and non-aligned nations. This also speaks to the question of the archive. Like, there's a lack of conversation, direct conversation or direct encounter. There's in the absence of a sort of historical encounter, for example, between Haddad and Atmatov. I'm trying to think about the ways in which that encounter can be exposed through a dialogue between the literary works themselves. And in doing so, I render visible the relationship between two genealogies of anti-imperial thinking, born from this non-aligned Bandung and lesser known as Soviet affiliate, the Afro-Asian Writers Association. And I use this case to argue that the Global South is more than a place, but a set of relations that structure political consciousness through a longing or desire for non-alignment. And the main way I'm framing this longing or desire is through a play on genre, and this is where I'm drawing on my literary training here. So the play on genre that occurs in these two novels. So both authors are experimenting with the notion of a devotional love poem or ghazal, which is shared across Turkic, Persian, and Arabic. On the one hand, as a socialist realist bildung in the case of Atmatov, and on the other as a narrative of awakening of a post-colonial national consciousness in the case of Haddad. So the comparative South-South framing from the vantage of these writers and their novels actually reveals the thread of a longing for this kind of impossibility of non-alignment, and also in its shade, the sort of its failure actually. Beneath the Soviet and nationalist novelistic structures. The other example is from a project on the Ilkhom Theater of Tashkent. This was hailed as the first independent, that is non-state theater in Central Asia, which opened in 1976. However, when I looked through the theater's archives recently, I found that it was in fact funded by a Soviet-sponsored experimental youth theater initiative. So it started as an agitational propaganda project performing in rural regions outside of Tashkent. But additionally, the theater hosted youth congresses for the Soviet-run Afro-Asian film festivals. But at the same time, the director, Mark Weil, ran an underground productions literally in the basement of the building late at night, often rehearsing till 5 in the morning. It seems that the Soviet authorities knew about these practices, but were satisfied by the daytime propaganda work and kind of turned their gaze away. So I'm interested in thinking here how South-South connections generated a space for experimental productions and for the possibility of thinking outside Soviet mandates. And furthermore, thinking about how the Ilkhom recuperated its kind of internationalist legacy after the collapse. Because it's still running today. So then I'm particularly interested in this post-Soviet period and how it is recuperating a kind of internationalism amidst the rise of Uzbek nationalism in the post-Soviet period by emphasizing in particular multilingual and multi-confessional theatrical repertoire, which reflected a kind of internationalist community ethos. So I'll close with these examples then, and of alternative South-South solidarity, which I think work both to problematize and perhaps recuperate a kind of South-South, if not global South, as a term. In the case of Atmatov and Haddad, the frame of South-South solidarity thus stages a play with genre and form to uncover a poetics of longing, while in the case of Ilkhom, It renders visible both the parasitical structure of the underground theater as well as the ways in which the theater's methods of improvisation staged an alternative international in the multilingual and multi-confessional plays and community they continue to attract. So if the term Global South or South-South can be reinvigorated, then I think it's not only through expanding world literature trajectories beyond Europe, but through thinking critically about the new structures of power that this geographical displacement produces.
Okay. Thanks, Prathama, and thanks, Leah, for sort of setting up the terms of the discussion and the debate. What I'll do is I'll take a slightly different route from what Leah took, which will primarily derive from two things. One is my disciplinary training in political science, where the term Global South or the term South has its own very different trajectory from what Leah just traced for us. And the second is my location in what is called, or what may be called, the Global South. So what I'm going to say will derive from these two locations. And I think I do not, unlike Leah, I do not engage with the term Global South in my work directly. But I will use some of my, use maybe one instance from my work on caste to illustrate some of the points that I'm going to make right now. So what I'll do is I will literally take that question, what, where, and when is the Global South, at face value, and enter this discussion by looking at and trying to find answers to that question. And I'll raise about 5 or 6 related points about this. And I think when I look at a question like this, the first thing I see is what is missing in that question, and that is the why, right? Which I think is a very important word, and it's important to start asking why Global South, right? Why at all, and why now, at this juncture? And why is it and how is it that we can have this discussion today between 3 very different kinds of institutions, sitting in this location where we are, location both geographically as well as sort of conceptually and analytically. So what enables, why this discussion now, what enables this discussion, and why do we even need to think about the Global South? And when I start asking these questions, I have to sort of go back to thinking of the trajectory that this concept or this term has had, its precursors, and how we've sort of arrived at today talking about something called when, where, and what of the Global South. And I think that this idea of a particular kind of political and socio-economic regions or peoples or cultures coming together has had many iterations in the past, each of which comes with its own baggage. So there has been the idea of the third world, which is not used much now, and Global South is seen as a sort of replacement of the third world. But there was that third world idea in relation to a first world, which is the capitalist world, and a second world, which is a socialist world, and a third world, which then got to be known as non-aligned, which got to be known as South, and then came up the ideas of a South-South collaboration, which Leah talked about in detail right now. So I think when we think of the Global South, it's very difficult to ignore the sort of political connotations that each of its precursors came with. And the very important fact that in all of these iterations, third world, South as such, Global South, South-South cooperation, I think all of these terms were sort of terms which came up as and in reaction to a discourse which was being set elsewhere. So none of these were actually terms which came up autonomously, even if autonomy is possible in such a scenario. But the so-called South, I don't know global or not, but the so-called South was always reacting and responding to the agenda set somewhere else. And I think it's important, if today we are resurrecting or trying to recuperate the term South or Global South, I think it's important to remember who's doing the agenda setting and what is this agenda setting leading us to. Also, when we today, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned Gramsci's The Southern Question, because that's one of the sort of earliest iterations that we see in political theory of the question of the South, not Global South, but of the question of the South, where he's basically talking about Italy and the northern Italy capitalists dominating or having a hegemonic relationship, hegemonic power over the peasants of the South. And I think it's important to go back to the question that Gramsci was raising then, which is that how do we make or how do we produce a solidarity between the peasants of the South and the workers of the North? Right? And much of his writing is actually about the difficulty in producing this alliance. And I think it's important to go back to that difficulty, to go back to that idea of a North-South or a South relationship. And I would be a little cautious in immediately extending this idea to solidarity, to any sort of alliance, because there is this big question which Gramsci and many others have actually underlined for us, which is how will this alliance be produced? What are the terms of this alliance? And is this alliance even going to give us something? The other thing is that we hardly use the term South now in this sense. We do not use it in the sense of at least sitting in the position that we're sitting right now, in the location that we're sitting right now. The term South, or the use of the term Global South, comes to us wrapped in that entire sort of Bretton Woods, WTO, and the new post-Cold War economic order discourse, where, we've had NAM, we've had the non-aligned movement, we've had the BRIC and the BRICS, and we've had many such attempts at South-South cooperation. But like I said initially, what has ended up happening is that we have, while talking about, because of the larger sort of political economic scenario globally, the South has simply sort of responded to the agenda that has been set by the Washington Consensus, that has been set by the Bretton Woods. And while these seem like macro level ideas and they seem like macro level policy changes, but sitting here, and especially since a lot of us come from sort of academic institutions, we see repercussions of this sort of failed negotiation between the North and the South in almost our everyday lives. So as we speak, we are witnessing a rampant sort of privatization of education, of resources, of livelihoods. And it's difficult to sort of sit here and ignore the fact that all of this comes as a package with the Global South. All of this comes as a package when we talk about a sort of North-South debate or a Global South solidarity and so on and so forth. And having said that, just a couple of points more. Having said that, because of this very complicated history that we come to inherit because of colonialism, because of Cold War, and also because of the peculiar kinds of conditions that colonialism and post-coloniality give places and countries and regions like ours, I am not sure if it is even possible to talk about, I think it's very difficult to talk about transnational solidarities at the moment. I'm not even sure if it's possible to talk about a vision of the South from within a particular country, right? And when I start thinking of these issues, what immediately came to my mind because of my own work with caste was 2001 and the UN Conference on Racism in Durban, right? Where where the Indian government refused to take a stand or to present caste as a subset of racism, right? Now, in a scenario where, and there was sort of a very widespread demand from Dalit groups and anti-caste groups within India uh, towards the Indian government to raise this issue and to include caste discrimination as an issue under racism, right, within the UN discourse. And the government of India and the Indian state stoutly refuses to do that. Now, when we are in such a scenario where the nation state is so important, the honor of the nation state is so important, where even transnational issues like migration and climate change and environmental concerns, actually not just here, but in the north as well, take on a very national stand, right? And we're all seeing what, say, Donald Trump is doing with the WTO right now, pulling out of all judicial measures and so on and so forth. And of course, cross-border migration and what is happening in India with the NRC and issues of migration and so on and so forth. I am very unsure that in a time when the nation state is resurging in such strong and and nationalism is resurging in such a strong way, I am not sure what a South-South solidarity or a South-South cooperation really means in this context, when we are afraid to even take up certain issues at international fora like the UN, which is one of the most benign of international forums, really. So I'll actually end with this, and I'll just end with one question, which is sort of reiterating what I already said, which is that does the sort of colonial anxieties that we inherited and the post-colonial politics that we are living through, do these even allow a South-South corporation or a global South to emerge? And if it emerges, what are the terms on which it emerges, and what does it really bring to the table? So that's about it. Thank you.
Wonderfully contrary positions. Now you have the tough job, Mark.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about how to be in the middle of these two things. But thank you for that, which was great. And Leah, it's nice to, I've read about what you're doing. It's just always nice to hear somebody talk it rather than just read it. I want to reinforce that there are two of my colleagues who are here from the University of Chicago who are also thinking about these issues in their work and where on a spectrum they may be, and thinking about these larger questions is something that I hope that we can hear from too, right? I guess I'd like to start by taking people down several notches to a much more kind of granular level around this. And to tell you a story, as historians sometimes do, and it's a story about an artist in Indonesia by the name of Harry Dono, who is probably the best known contemporary artist in Indonesia. That may not mean that any of you have ever heard of Harry Dono, but nonetheless, within his own context, an important figure. And a figure who came of age in the early 1990s. So for him, and he and I had a chance to talk together a lot this summer, there were some things that happened to him in the early 1990s that really fundamentally changed his affect, the way in which he thought about himself, and the way in which he thought about the kind of work that he was doing. And so the story he told me was, he was an art school student in Yogyakarta, and he just didn't feel as if what was going on in art school was doing anything for him. That the people who were teaching him wanted him to do oil painting, and they wanted him to do maybe a little representative sculpture, and that's how they were going to be evaluating whether he should get his art degree, whether he was a good artist or he was not a good artist. And he just felt as if, and it wasn't just him, but a number of students felt as if what that world had to teach them, which was a kind of third world modernist way of thinking about art inflected by a colonial curriculum earlier, so the full sort of range of history bearing down on it, no longer spoke to them in a way that was of interest at all. And so there had been this biennale in Yogyakarta that essentially the art school controlled. So if you did your oil painting, you were invited to, exhibit in the biennale. And they decided to stage an alternative biennale that's called mean sort of wild horses. There was performance that they were doing. It was all kind of outside of, the normal realms of art. Their teachers were horrified by this, but it was a kind of sort of public way of kind of breaking with a past. So Dono goes on from this to do all kinds of things in his work. He actually does paint. So the painting doesn't go away. He makes sculptures, so that part of his life doesn't go away. But he performs, he's interested in the folk, but he's interested in transforming the folk into some kind of contemporary language, interested in using shadow puppets to do this. There's just an incredible creative vitality to what he's trying to do in the 1990s. As I've talked to, and I've now talked to maybe 50 or 60 artists who kind of came of age in Southeast Asia in the 1990s, they tell an origin story that's not so different than the one that Harry Dono is telling. A feeling that somehow the historical possibilities that had been imposed on them were burdens that were no longer something that they wanted to work with, and that they needed to make a kind of break. And as they made that break, they were simultaneously defining a contemporary, right? A moment that nobody really understood what it was, that a moment that was very much in the process of becoming, and their move from one to the other was what did that. To me, the answers to these questions about what, where, when, and why are that you can't disconnect the rise of what I would say is a kind of imaginary of the Global South and the rise of the contemporary, whatever it is that the contemporary means. And I don't honestly think that any of us understand what either of those things mean very well, right? The contemporary still is a hazy notion, under-theorized compared to the modern, to the post-colonial, to the Third World, to the Cold War. Similarly, with the Global South. So that there's a kind of like residual excitement, like you can kind of reconstitute the excitement of what the 90s might be now by looking back at that moment and trying to think, what was going on there? And did it mark some kind of fundamental rupture? I'm a historian, and people in my discipline don't really get super comfortable about studying the 20th century, let alone the 1990s and forward. So the work that I'm doing, history, it's funny, I've been a historian all my life, but suddenly history's not helping very much in thinking through what this might mean. But I think that's a kind of valuable thing, in a sense, because if you're trying to figure out something that's very close to now, and you always insist that there's a genealogy to it, there's a real chance that you'll miss the rupture for the continuities. And so for the moment in my work, I just want it to be ruptured 24/7. I'm probably wrong about that. There probably are more continuities that need to get added in over time. But if I can relax continuity and simply focus on rupture, I think I can begin to capture a little bit of a sense about what that break might have been. So again, I totally admit that if you want to come back to me with, well, there's this, there's that, I'm sure there is. And in like a year or two, I'll be happier to hear that I'm sure there is. But right now, if I keep saying, yes, you're right, there's that thing, I don't think the thing itself is going to go away from me, right? So to me, there is this moment that happens in a very kind of embodied, particular way in an artist like Harry Dono, but it's also happening in a kind of transnational space, just as you were describing, I think. And the kind of intersection of the two is where I think this can often get quite complicated, because somehow at the level of transnational space, there is a set of kind of hegemonic notions that are being reinscribed and who's setting the terms that are very problematic. And yet there are people living in that space, I think, who are trying to reinvent themselves in very fundamental ways that sometimes borrow on what that language is and sometimes upend that language altogether. But it is the space that they occupy in one form or another, and it's a different space, perhaps, than people were occupying even as late as the 1960s or the 1970s. So, the basic structures that bring the Global South into being, most people here have a sense about what that might look like, right? So you think about the sort of rise of neoliberalism, you think about very different migratory patterns happening. Really, I think these are all 1970s forward things. I don't think 89 and the end of the Cold War is really super central to this, that the structural things are happening quite separately than that. And then the communications revolution, which now can seem so kind of pedestrian, right? That there were faxes and that there were overnight mail, and like, so what? But actually, when you talk to people in the 1990s, they can't quite believe that these things existed to let people communicate in such an easy way. To them, it's the social media of now, right? So I've come to realize that those things comparatively can seem small, but actually operated in quite big revolutionary ways in the particular moment. So there's those larger structural kinds of factors. Again, these are no surprise to anybody, right? But I also think that there fundamentally is a kind of revolution in affect. And that revolution in affect is happening in simultaneous places around the world, and that it's not a construction of the Washington consensus. It's not some sort of ideologically imposed thing, that it's a kind of urgency, and I'm trying to understand where that urgency comes from, because how can an artist in Thailand, and an artist in Indonesia, and an artist in Singapore, and an artist in Vietnam all tell me a similar kind of origin story about where they were at the beginning of the 90s, unless there is a simultaneity that, again, doesn't necessarily reflect these sort of bigger structural concerns. We live under them, they lived under them, but there's an agency in that, I think, that needs to get recovered as well. So the project that I'm working on is kind of moving in both dimensions. On the one hand, thinking about some of the issues that you're raising. So I wanted to do something with the digital humanities. This has just been a kind of methodological interest of mine for some time. And it occurred to me that, every September, the world leaders come to New York and they give those speeches, right? We went through a series of interesting Trump speeches recently where world leaders actually laughed at the President of the United States, but you know the basic sort of thing. They come, they speak, they go. But what would happen if you could simultaneously read, there's like 10,000 plus of those speeches. What if you could simultaneously read those speeches from roughly 1946 to now through machine learning and get a sense about, do the subjects change? Do the adjectives and adverb descriptors of the subjects change? Do the very constructions of the sentences change as time goes forward? And so the project was to say, if you take 1989, just to take the canonical moment, and you look at speeches before and you look at speeches after, what do you see? And what kind of changes do you see over time? And you do, in fact, see some considerable changes, some of which I always think digital humanities projects kind of reinforce what you already intuitively thought anyway, so there's an element that it does do that. More people are talking about the environment and climate, surprisingly, than were in 1945, right? You get that kind of thing. But you also get a sort of sensibility shift about the kind of like helper words that come around familiar words like governance or development or what people mean by that. So you start to get words like capability and resilience. And you can say, oh, that's the neoliberal speak and that's corporate speak, and it's true, it is those things. But it does emerge at a particular moment, and it does emerge with some frequency in the ways in which world leaders are speaking. Whether that's imposed or not imposed, I'm not entirely sure. Like, that's a hard kind of causation thing to sort out in one form or another. To some degree, yes. To some degree, I wonder, actually, if there are ways to kind of deploy that language for your own devices, even if the language is coming from someplace else. So you look at something like the Human Development Index, which emerges in the 1990s as well, all around this notion of capabilities as a different way of thinking about how development works and where people can take that in one form or another. So that part of the project, trying to think at a really global level, really sort of from 30,000 feet, what kinds of vocabularies might be changing in this moment of the global south, and then maybe to come down in a particular thing like capabilities and think about how that moves itself out over time. Second part of the project is a more visual art-based way of thinking about what the emergence of a global south might mean. And it comes from a kind of pedestrian observation that, again, will be common to all of you, that there is a surprising surge of, again, let's just use the global south as a descriptor for now and not worry about the ideology that comes with it, a presence of the global south in world culture beginning in the 1990s in ways that you simply don't see before, right? So the simplest way of saying this is, if you had to pick the artist of the 20th century, the single artist of the 20th century, most influential visual artist of the 20th century, who would that be? Picasso? Is that a reasonable? Yeah, yeah. But I think Warhol maybe? Yeah, okay, yeah, yeah. Either one works for my, for my purposes. I think if you had to do it for the 21st century, for now you would say Ai Weiwei, right? What does it mean to give Warhol and Picasso as the one answer and Ai Weiwei as the other example? And what's happened structurally, institutionally, aesthetically in that space that allows that shift over time, right? So there's where I think looking at a granular level at one particular space of artists' work. And I like Southeast Asia, partially that's a place where I've done a lot of my own work, so it's a place that I'm comfortable in. But it's also a place where a lot of comparative stuff is going on. You've got Buddhist states, you've got Islamic states, you've got Christian peoples, you've got ethnic groups, you've got authoritarianism from hard authoritarianism to soft authoritarianism. You've got a big range of things going on in one place to be able to think about, again, how the contemporary, how the global, how the South gets created in that particular space, and examples where artists themselves are trying to think in South-South ways, some of which fail spectacularly, and some of which actually succeed in kind of small ways, right? You know, the vision is big, but actually on the ground, what's able to be achieved can sometimes be small. That doesn't mean it's insignificant. It just means that it can only happen in certain kinds of conditions. So for me, kind of trying to pivot again, sort of from high up to sort of more granularly focused around art, and taking really seriously for now the question of when. And that the when really for me is driving a lot of this. If the when is the 90s as a moment to really look at, and it was funny today in our conversation that was coming up too. You know, people have a lot to say about the 90s, right? And they don't necessarily have what I have to say about the 90s, but the 90s occupy a really critical space, I think, in kind of debating this back and forth and figuring out what the larger significance is. So again, as I say, for now, I'm happy to hover in the 90s. I'm happy to hover with rupture rather than.
All right, thank you, all three of you. Just before I open to the floor, one thing that really struck me, you know, that in some senses, how much we have moved from the Gramscian moment, where the question was of people's solidarity, proletariat solidarity, solidarity across proletariat and peasants. But in both your presentations, it's the intellectual, the artist, and the novelist who have the center stage. So in my mind, the global South, as we are thinking of on this panel, is not succeeding the international, even though some of your subjects have the idea of the international working for them. We are talking of an intellectual and artistic space that we are trying to create irrespective of geoterritorial boundaries, and which, as you're saying, some people are very often unwittingly living. But these people are artists and thinkers and intellectuals. So to put the question very starkly, is the global South an intellectual cartography, and is that how we are wanting to establish it? Now, I say that also because if we just put aside the colonial, the post-colonial and question and what we call modern geopolitics aside, there is a much older history to what can be called thought channels and thought trajectories, or networks created by traveling artifacts or ideas. I mean, I'm thinking of the work that I teach sometimes because of fascinating, a kind of visual studies person called Laura Marks' book on infinity and enfoldment, who shows how, for instance, Islamic pointillism, or pointillism is, of course, a kind of imposed word on that, travels via Duns Scotus and et cetera, Europe, and eventually to Deleuze and to algorithmic art. Now, this is completely aside of communist international, third world, first world, global South. it is a kind of different thought trajectory or artistic trajectory. And there are some scholars who are invested in recovering these alternative trajectories of thought. For all you know, Laura Marx's argument is that it is contemporary. And it is coming forth in digital art, unlike in the way that it was suppressed in, let's say, history of aesthetic theory in the 20th century. Right? So there is something to the idea of the contemporary, but the contemporary is extraordinarily not self-same. And in it's not a kind of chronological linear time in which we have arrived at the contemporary, but it's kind of a charged crisscrossing of various temporalities, which is very often also non-modern. I would actually insist on that aspect also, because it allows us to circumvent this other trajectory of, and surely, there have been a number of, for instance, Hindi literatures who have spent enormous amount of time in Tashkent and parts of Central Asia. And the aesthetics they produce is neither of that time nor of now, in a sense. I mean, it's completely falls outside the Soviet imagination, but also completely outside a very standardized modernist, Western European modernist trajectory. So, it's just some amount of play with time is involved in this project, much more than play with space is in my is a kind of sense that I have. So just a kind of thought to share. Okay, open to all of you, and please feel free. We have about half an hour, I think. 20 minutes or so. So we'll collect some questions and comments, and then we'll have a quick response from that.
The Global South, the term is very fascinating because I'm starting with a very light note. In Delhi School of Social Work, where I studied, we used to have a room called the Global South, where we used to have the classes on social movement and also the social protests. How do we design? How do we respond to different things? And also the peace building and conflict mitigation. So the classroom churning came into my mind when you were talking about the Global South. The other part which came to my mind in response, which you were talking about, Shivani, that many times we respond to what is happening. But many times in India, in the so-called the Global South, which we are talking about, many things came out in different shapes, not in shape of the responses or the reactions. And those, especially the generation which witnessed the Bandung conference, and before the Bandung, the Delhi, before independence in India, the Nehru had led a conference here of the Afro-African leaders. So the generation did many experiments in India. Those who were the intellectuals, those who were the artists and the academicians in the post-Bandung conference generation, they created numerous amount of things which were not the reactions. And one such experiment, I saw Professor Sanjay here, and you are also associated with the center, the Lokayan experiment in CSDS, where a lot work had been created, not in the form of the reactions, but it was around the how we deal with the issue of hegemony, how we respond to the hegemony of the US or the Soviet bloc. How can we create the new things? So I think when we are talking about these kind of blocks of power, we should also explore the humane and human explorations of doing things, without the boundary or without the backing of the power structures such as the US or the Soviet bloc.
I was just wondering if, okay, I was just wondering if we are still, from hearing all of you, it felt like we're still not, we're falling into the trap of understanding the global south from a geopolitical, geographical understanding of where the global north is and where the global south is. And especially if we think of global south in conjunction with the history of global capital, and it came out in several of your discussion, then there's a possibility of also seeing the presence of global south in what is supposedly geographical global north. So the case of Brexit showed us how Greece is, there's much more in common with India and Greece in some ways than, say, Greece has in common with Germany. Or in the case of, for example, a state like Louisiana in America or Oklahoma in America, where the case of the presence of a certain kind of environmental degradation that was being spoken about yesterday in Raka Ray's lecture at CSDS, creates a different kind of a relationship of neo-colonialism, and she would call it internal colonialism. So then what does that kind of, so it's not merely transnational in that sense. And I don't think digital humanities is necessarily the way in which, or technology is the one which would make that switch into creating or dispersing these kinds of boundaries necessarily. Because if one looks at how, say, London, New York, and Tokyo are located, they're all located on a straight line across that map. And Saskia Sassen's work would show that the most amount of information actually travels between these three cities at a really, really fast rate. So as much as it disperses, it also consolidates, it also coagulates. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentations. I really enjoyed the conversation. What's coming across as salient to me based on this panel is this question of, I suppose the Global South is also in conjunction with a kind of internationalism. And then for me, the question becomes what makes the longing for internationalism possible? Like, so what makes the longing for global South connections or South-South solidarities possible? And for me, I'm thinking about it as an awareness question also, like what makes an awareness of, the possibility of South-South connections possible, like what, and I'm wondering if it's also a subjectivity question, because the global South is also like a question of desiring this idea of the global South versus the global North. So I'm just, and it's interesting because I'm thinking in that light, I'm thinking of Shivani's presentation where you briefly mentioned that there's this idea of saying that caste discrimination is racism. And, that's also tied to this idea of like taking a very specific kind of, like I suppose a specific situation and, like I would read it as making it also, like international. So just that. Thank you.
I was also very intrigued by the question of time in relation to space and sort of thinking about the temporal scope of the global South. Particularly, I think in history there is this turn towards the global, and to really think of what that means in terms of whether is it transnational, is it transregional, and I'm wondering if, you said you were more interested in rupture rather than continuity. But I wonder if the Global South also gets us at something that goes beyond the 20th century, back in time, and also looks as closely at rupture as it does at continuity. Because what tends to happen is that with a lot of the given terms in terms of colonial, post-colonial, the modern, the contemporary, we have particular attachments in terms of cartographic time and space. And I wonder, I mean, the Global South also clearly has certain affective ties, as we've already outlined in terms of the late 20th century. But I wonder if it can capture something about this moment as well, where we're looking at, a different kind of unity of time and space than has been possible historically.
Any other comments? All right, so I'll just hand it over to all of you.
I mean, I guess I'll pick up here with this notion of time, and I mean, I really like the idea of thought currents as well that you're suggesting here, Prathama, because I think it's not only just, for me, it's not only just looking at the sort of intellectual genealogy or a kind of intellectual currents of South-South thought, but the ways in which the work itself, the work itself dialogue, like the relationship between the literary texts themselves, expose a dialogue rather than thinking about the agency of the actors themselves. Because I think something that comes into the fore for me there is also evoked in your response, Mark. I mean, in terms of this notion of the revolution in affect that occurs at this moment. It's kind of like a reverberance within the work, in which there's not a direct speaking to, which would frame like a kind of notion of agency. I don't think that recuperating the notion of South-South either as an institutional term, that is like the actions of government bodies or sort of state institutions, or businesses or whatever, or as like an individual actors is terribly useful. But thinking about the kind of reverberances between these thoughts and what new emerges from their interaction is most interesting here. And I think also this raises the question of technology, right? And I think one thing that we can see if we look at a kind of longer trajectory, as I'm interested in doing, and kind of going back to the 70s, I agree with you that 1989 is a kind of moment, but that asks us to look further back. And when we look back at this, at like, the 70s as a long period of, in the case of the Soviet Union, the long period of Soviet collapse, it raises the kind of question more broadly of mediation. That is to say, not only the use of particular new technologies, but really the function of mediating political discourse. And I'm thinking now of like the simultaneous translation that occurs at the congresses, right? And the dissonance actually that creates. And that's what I'm really interested in, is that dissonance and those moments of failure to comprehend, the failure to translate, the absences in the stenography reports. I think these spaces offer the possibilities of reimagining a kind of new international or some kind of vision of solidarity. I mean, I think that the term solidarity, or this idea of creating an interlinking set of resonances across this space, is really important to me, because I've also been thinking a lot in my work on the rise of the new right and the rise of new fascist movements. And so for me, this kind of recuperation of the space of the literary and this sort of echoes of affective resonances are important for imagining a kind of force of resistance that the literary, I think, or artistic practice itself can offer us.
I think I'll just briefly pick on 3 of the comments which were made. So, I mean, yeah, of course you're right. It's been a long sort of trajectory of these concepts, and of course there are moments where work has happened which cannot be categorized as a reaction, for sure. But all I was trying, so I didn't mean that no work has happened, but all I was trying to point out was exactly how you ended your question, which is that, how can we respond to hegemony outside of power blocks? But I was exactly pointing to that framing of the question, when we have to think of responding to power blocks. And much of our time, energy, and resources actually goes in formulating that response. And by the time we do it, the discourse has changed. And again, we see it every day today, right? So that's all I was saying, that it's, like Vijay Prashad said, third world is not a place, it's a project. Right? So just extending that and saying most of these are actually maybe just reactions. Sushmita, yeah, of course. I mean, I didn't mean to just pin it down to geopolitics, but that's a useful way for me to start thinking about these debates and then maybe go on to what the other two panelists said in terms of thinking through affect, through desire, and through these other sort of spaces of rupture, for sure. And you're absolutely right about there being sort of these pockets and envelopes of not just the South in the so-called North, but also what we see in India, where we have pockets of extreme affluence and pockets which are exactly like the global North, which is why I am not sure how these sort of dispersed pockets of affluence as well as sort of marginalization would come together given their particular political economic situation. So I'm just interested in asking of a project like this as to what are the terms on which these very differently situated spaces, wherever geographically they are, wherever they come. And yeah, I mean, absolutely thanks for saying neo-capital and neo-colonialism, because I think while we talk about post-Cold War and such, I mean, these are two terms that a project such as this must think about. And to go to the question of the desire for internationalization, I mean, I'm not sure what makes sort of an internationalism possible or where the desire comes from, but I can answer the point you raised about caste, which is that in this particular case, much like caste's relationship to modernity and colonial modernity, there was actually a desire to internationalize the issue, precisely because the domestic was not being able, or still not being able, to actually even recognize the issue, much less actually do something about it. So the hope was, which I think is legitimate to a certain extent, that linking it up to a universal category, which is a universally recognized category of racism, where previously things like Zionism had also got into that same list, it would actually be fruitful to raise, it would sort of enable anti-caste activists here and groups here to actually raise that question on more sort of broader, more complex fora, than just make it an internal issue. So I think in that sense, which is why I raised the Durban issue, because that was one moment where some solidarity, South, North, whatever, could have really worked, right? But it did not, because of sort of very deep-seated local issues and the way that we think about local issues. So that could have been one fruitful moment of internationalizing something, and while not letting caste lose its specificity in the South Asian context, but yet make it sort of translatable, make it sort of translate for other contexts, right? So just that. Actually, the committee was a UN Committee on Racism, Xenophobia, and Forms of Discrimination. So I think that gets.
Quickly, and to pick up on, I guess, on your question about space, and where is this space of the global South? And it's true, the thing about the pockets, that the pockets of the global North and the South, vice versa. But I also think that there are ways in which the spaces are getting more mixed up than that it isn't just about pockets and things being delineated, but that there's a fluidity in some of the spaces. And it's kind of hard hard to know what'll happen out of that, right? There's sort of, it's a process very much becoming. And so one space that I'm interested in following is, I don't know how much people know about the art world, but they're like two international exhibitions that happen on a regular basis that for the art world, which is still pretty Euro-American, is, you know, like the main chance, right? So the Venice Biennale and Documenta in Germany, these tend to be, now there are biennales all over the world. Why it is we have to pay more attention to those two than the others, right? We'll bracket that for just a minute, but those are the ones that are at least controlled by, again, a kind of traditional Euro-American art world. So this year, the organizers of Documenta, one of these two institutions, invited a collective from Indonesia to serve as the curator for Documenta. This will be in 3 years' time, a group called Ruin Grupa, collective of about 16 people. They've been around since 2000. They don't do very traditional art projects at all because it operates in a kind of collective form, some installation, some performance, some publication, kind of all over the map in certain ways. But it's a very localized practice, super localized in what it is that they do. It's very much, they're in Jakarta, it's very much Jakarta-based. So I went to see them after they, you know, this announcement and just said, well, you know, like, why did they invite you? How come they wanted you to do this? And their response came like right away, and that was, well, the entire form is exhausted, and they know that it's exhausted. And the Western art world is exhausted by the form, and they don't know what to do about it. So they took a chance and they invited us. And maybe we can reinvigorate this form for them, or maybe we can recreate the form. But they also said, you know, if it all doesn't work out, we're just going to walk out the door, and they'll still be stuck with their Documenta. So they have this really interesting sort of like, we're not, they understand that they're there because, as one of them put it to me, they've essentially outsourced creativity to them because they can't figure out what to do, but that they don't really have any ownership for it. Like, if it works, it works. And one of the other things that they talked about quite a bit was, where would they be looking for artists? And so one of the responses was in pockets. Like, they wanted to talk about who's on the South Side, who's doing cool work in Chicago. They wanted to talk about who's in Detroit, who's doing work that they might want to bring to the table. So again, a really, really different vision of kind of what this thing might be. It's a really interesting set of developments that the Western art world suddenly is at the mercy of Ruin Grupa in certain kinds of ways. One never would have predicted that in the 1960s or the 1970s when modernism and MoMA was at its height, but also the kind of nonchalant attitude toward, well, you know, we'll do what we do, and if that works, that works, and if it doesn't work, that doesn't work. Also gets to this issue of like, who's got agency, and whether people are just imitating forms or whether people are, you know, taking, they're not imitating anything at all. They've just got a way of being in the world, and they're going to see if that way of being can be extended on an international stage in that kind of platform. Maybe it can, maybe it can't. But again, I think it's not just the particularities of that case, and I'll be curious how that case works itself out. It'll be 2 years before we know. But I think it's those kinds of cases that can help us think about a just fundamentally different set of patterns that isn't the sort of resistance or imitation or, you know, some of the familiar tropes that we have about how ideas or culture move in the world. It's upending those. And we don't really have a vocabulary exactly to talk about what those upended categories now look like. And so one of the exciting parts about all this is it gives us a space, it gives us a time, and it gives us a place just to do Leah's 3 things as a kind of laboratory, at least as humanities scholars and social science scholars, to rethink some of those fundamental categories, potentially in really innovative and creative ways. And I think that's the energy and the sort of fun of the kind of work that people, all of us, are thinking about doing in this regard.
All right, thank you. Anybody have the last minute thoughts? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
Just a comment for you. I wanted to understand what is at stake in simultaneous translation for you at the level of, I mean, I'm not sure whether I got it. Are we just talking about the dissonance that it creates? Therefore, sort of, and the dissonance sort of being, you know, to be able to welcome that dissonance because it is ostensibly more democratic. I sort of lost that point. I mean, you also know that simultaneous translation goes back to the Nuremberg trial and plays out
Yeah.
very differently there, as opposed to, say, in the Bikindi trial, where it causes a very different kind of effect. I'm not sure what was at stake in that. Also, the other thing is, I'm wondering whether setting up a question in this way, what, where, when is the global south, is already sort of beset with the possibility of bad faith conversations, where, 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 where the brown person takes on the burden of saying, well, hey, we always were, but not in the way you want us to be, and and you take on the burden, as it were, the non-brown, as it were, takes on the burden of pointing towards, say, ruptures and creativity and simultaneity of this kind. I'm not sure. I feel like, so what, where, I think that what, where, and when is the parochial south would be a much more comfortable question for all of us to take on, as opposed to the global south, because it puts a very different kind of burden. I think what, where, when is the parochial north is also a much more easy question to take on, as opposed to this is a bad faith. It will be, I think, by definition, a bad faith discussion.
I think that's the point. Explosive end. Your response.
As for simultaneous translation, I mean, I think I'm also thinking about like the sense of the audience, the community that's created through the simultaneous translation, and the possibilities not only of dissonance but like mistranslation to occur. So like in the Baku Congresses, this was very famous because they held in the 1920s. This was very famous because there were like calls for revolution as jihad were was intended to create. And so I'm thinking about, in that sense, the ways in which the translation project in the case of the former Soviet Union was both a part of the propaganda arms of the empire, but also allowed for alternative forms of or alternative forms of solidarity, alternative visions of the ways in which the revolution might go. And so that's what I'm thinking about for that. Is as in terms of the question, I mean, I think it's a very interesting and provocative point, and I think, you know, for me, it's really the case of coming to this question from my own disciplinary standpoint, that is from the kind of literary discipline, and also coming to it from the context of working in the former Soviet Union, in which the South would never be a point articulated. So it's really like, it's really a different, it's really trying to put my work into conversation with a certain disciplinary academic environment that it would not already be. So it takes on a different kind of dimension that I could see than were I working actually within a trajectory that would be commonly understood in the as the global South.
We can take the discussion outside, of course. But I just want to, I mean, it's a kind of tangential response to, you know, there is a certain impetus to this argument, which is going in interesting ways. I think one thing is very clear. I mean, whether we go for the term global south or not, aside, there is a certain exhaustion at the post-colonial moment. I mean, we have done the post-colonial critique, and very productively, and we have done the provincializing act very productively. So now, right, so there is the need to, and of course there is a certain suffocation at the global north imposing its agenda, but there's an equal suffocation of our nationalism, right? So there is need to break those walls, and therein, if there is at all a desire for meeting unexpected friends and strange neighbors whom we don't know, Southeast Asian is a strange, proximate but stranger to us. That is wherein the desire lies. And it's probably that what we're trying to explore, you know. After post-colonialism, what? And I think, you know, dissidence and, you know, dissension of this variety that we have had on the panel is hugely productive, I think. And the disagreement is hugely productive. And on that diplomatic note, I shall rest my case and, and please feel free to get us say hello outside. And thank you for coming.